Welcome and thank you for tuning into A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM with Brian, Matt, Emily, Aminder, Alicia, and Matthew. We are third-year BSN students at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, BC. We are working to demystify health issues affecting our community, bringing you evidence-based information about our healthcare. This information is for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare provider. We would like to start our show by acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Nanaimo people.
Hello, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Matt, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Hello, hello.
We are third-year nursing students at Vancouver Island University. We're continuing our topic of invisible illnesses within our community, and today we're talking about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. We'd just like to add a short disclaimer that we're aware that some of the topics we'll be discussing today could potentially be triggering for some people. And if you do feel triggered, definitely reach out for help. You can always reach the Island Crisis Line at 1-888-494-3888. There are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week phone crisis line that you can access at any time.
We decided to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder for one of our episodes because it's a really unfortunately common mental illness that affects all kinds of people, not just the veterans and emergency workers like it's sometimes stereotyped to be. But Matt and I both actually have some experience with areas of emergency response where post-traumatic stress disorder can occur and does often occur. Matt is a paramedic, and I've worked with search and rescue for many years, and the unfortunate reality of working in areas of emergency response is that sometimes pretty traumatic things can actually happen, and you can see some pretty gruesome, difficult images and be put in some precarious situations. So
yeah, PTSD is an issue which I personally haven't been impacted by, but many of my friends and coworkers have, and I've seen it happen, and I know how easily it can happen to people. So I'm excited to talk about PTSD today and kind of spread some awareness about it because it is a very relevant topic to our society in general.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
So a little bit about the history of PTSD. It was originally recognized as a diagnosis in 1980. This is according to the Canadian Encyclopedia.ca. However, accounts of shell shock go back as far as the First World War, and other accounts of mental illness, symptoms of mental illness go back, like after trauma, go back as far as the Roman Empire. So it's really been an issue that has always been there, but we're only just beginning to kind of recognize how prevalent and significant it really is.
According to the DSM-5, which is sort of the authoritative guide to diagnosis of mental illness in Western medicine, post-traumatic stress disorder is diagnosed through a number of symptoms needing to be present. So first, someone needs to have experienced a stressor. That could be direct exposure to something traumatizing. It could be witnessing it. It could even take the form of learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to the trauma, or even indirect exposure. There are a lot of ways that people can experience stressors. The second criteria is that someone needs to have intrusive symptoms. So that could be nightmares, flashbacks, just general unwanted and upsetting memories. One of those is required for diagnosis. The third criteria is some kind of avoidant behaviors. One of those is also required. So essentially that just means any kind of avoidance of stimulation that can bring back feelings of the trauma or being exposed to it. And the last criteria, which is required for diagnosis of PTSD, is that people need to have two different negative alterations in their cognition or mood. So that could be just general negativity. It could be a decreased interest in activities, feelings of isolation, exaggerated blame of self, those sorts of things. And these symptoms need to occur for at least 1 month consistently.
Next, we're going to listen to an interview that Ryan and I had with a close mutual friend of ours who struggled with PTSD in the past. We're going to explore the incident that happened to her, what the trauma was that she experienced, and then go into some of the ways that she was able to heal and develop from that, how she was able to cope with some of the signs and symptoms and what those were, and move on from the trauma that happened to her.
So my story with PTSD began in 2016 when my family and I went to Nice, France on vacation. It was Bastille Day in France, and we were having dinner along the Promenade d'Anglais, watching the fireworks for the festivities, and we ended up witnessing a terrorist attack. A man drove a large truck into the crowds of thousands of people and ended up killing 84 people. It was a really horrible thing to witness, and a couple months after that, I started to notice symptoms of PTSD. I was constantly having recurring thoughts of the incident. I was constantly having nightmares. I was constantly experiencing anxiety. I was really depressed. So I ended up going to counseling, and later to my doctor, who diagnosed me with PTSD. It was a really big struggle to realize that that's what I had, because I had known about PTSD and known that it was a really hard thing to deal with and cope with. So my first kind of step that I took to kind of deal with it was I started going to counseling, and I started doing, I think it was cognitive behavioral therapy, and I did that for a little while. That wasn't really working to the best that it could be working, so I ended up trying EMDR, and EMDR really worked for me. It was a really good therapy for me, and I ended up having a really big decrease in my symptoms. I stopped having nightmares, I stopped shaking all the time, I stopped having such extreme anxiety, and it was it was a really good thing.
What is EMDR?
Well, for me, the technique that I did, there's a couple different techniques. One of the techniques is called tapping. So you tap you tap one side of your hand, either the backs of your hands or the backs of your thighs or something like that. My technique that I did was the therapist would wave her hand back and forth, and I had to track her hand with my eyes. And that kind of eye movement allows you to, while you are doing while you're tracking the movement with your eyes, you're supposed to be thinking of the event and thinking of the traumatic events that took place. And then while you're doing that with the eye movement, it allows your brain to think of it and to process the memories in a different way. And basically it allows your brain to store the memories in a safe way so that it stores it into the past tense, so it's not constantly being brought up in the future tense. Because that was a big problem for me with PTSD, was that the incident, the terrorist attack, was constantly being brought up in my mind. Every time I went into a crowd, I would experience these symptoms and I would think that something was going to happen. Every time I was around a big group of people or in a social situation, I would get really flustered and think something bad was going to happen. I was constantly repeating the negative events in my mind. And I just had a really hard time coping with that. Mm-hmm. And once I was able to file the memories into kind of the past tense, it really helped me to cope.
How old were you in 2016?
I was 19.
Okay. So any other treatments that you found helpful besides EMDR?
There have been a couple medications that have really helped me with my PTSD symptoms. I was actually hospitalized, and that is where I met a psychiatrist who continued to treat me for PTSD and put me on a new medication for my nightmares called olanzapine. And ever since taking that, I've been taking it probably for almost a year and a half now. And ever since then, my nightmares have completely gone away. I used to have them almost every single night, and it would be a recurring nightmare of being back in Nice. I've also gone through periods of being extremely suicidal, and when I'm in those kind of periods. A treatment that is helpful is just being in the hospital. I've had to do that a couple times this year, just to stabilize on medication or to just be in a safe spot. And I've had some good treatment at the hospital from doing that.
That's good to hear. What would be some, if you have any, what would be some suggestions for how people can interact with people who they suspect might be suffering from PTSD?
I think, speaking from my own experiences, what has helped me is it helps just to listen and be there for someone who is experiencing PTSD. Sometimes people really need to talk. Sometimes people don't want to talk. Just being there for someone, just being present with someone can help. Understanding that people can get triggered really easily and that it's not a personal thing. People have all different types of triggers. It's kind of hard to navigate them, but just being there for a person and just holding space and, being present, I think is one of the most important things. If they want to tell their story, then give them the space to do that and don't interrupt them with kind of your own stories. Just let them get it all out there.
How do you think your concepts of resiliency and psychological health have changed in the last little while, given your experiences?
I think I've realized in terms of resiliency, the importance of self-care, of taking care of yourself. For me, that's been things like going to counseling, trying to do things that are healthy for my mental health, like meditation. I'm trying to practice mindfulness. These are all things that I try to do. I don't always manage to do them, but I think to be resilient, you have to set up a good foundation for yourself. And that can be with things like counseling, physical exercise, that kind of stuff. But of course, that's really hard to do when you're suffering from things like PTSD sometimes. Sometimes it can just kind of drag you into a dark hole, and it's really hard to get out of that. Also, just kind of coping with PTSD over time, you just kind of naturally build up resiliency, because that's such a difficult thing to manage, that you kind of develop coping skills, and that kind of adds to your resiliency.
For sure. Are there any positive things that's come out of your experience that you've noticed or you would like to share?
Yeah, there definitely have been some positives. I think the whole experience has made me into a more compassionate person and a more understanding person. Just because I've gone through these struggles, I now understand when other people are going through similar struggles. It's definitely just the fact that it was kind of a near-death kind of experience has given me like a greater appreciation for life. So even though the near-death part is part of the PTSD, it does give me a big appreciation for life and for everything that I have. And I think it's just made me more in tune with my mental health as a person, because everybody has mental health regardless of whether or not you have mental illness. So this kind of drew attention to my mental health and me realizing that I wasn't doing enough for it. There definitely have been some positives that have come out of it.
Awesome.
So a bit earlier, you talked about some of the resources, like in the hospital and with medications and different therapies that you've used. But what are some more resources that you may have used or that you just know of that might be beneficial to someone who's experiencing PTSD in Nanaimo?
There's a lot of resources in Nanaimo. I've used several. There are, first of all, if you're in a suicidal crisis or you feel like you are at risk of hurting yourself, the psychiatric emergency services at the hospital is there for you to go and get assessed and seen by a psychiatrist. I've used that service multiple times. There have been times where I've just been there for a day, and there's been times where I've been admitted for a couple weeks to the inpatient unit. So it's hard to take that step for sure, to reach out and actually go to the hospital. It can be pretty scary, but they are there, and it's a really important resource to know about. Another resource is the Crisis Outreach Response Team, or CORE. I've used them as well. If you're having a crisis, it can be a suicidal crisis or another emotional crisis, and you feel like you're at risk of hurting yourself or hurting someone else, It can be an alternative to going to the hospital. You can give them a call and they can come to you wherever you are in the community, which is nice. It makes it a little bit more accessible. There is also a mental health emergency crisis clinic at Brooks Landing, and you can see a counselor and talk to someone, see someone there. They're attached to a psychiatry an outpatient clinic, but it might be a little bit of a wait time to see them, so it's usually best if you're in a crisis to go to the counseling clinic. There's also a mental health outreach center on Barron's Road. I've been there. They run out some DBT groups and stuff, which is a good place to build skills. I've done some DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, and I've learned some skills for dealing with emotional crisis, distress tolerance, mindfulness, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's pretty much the most of the services that I've used in Nanaimo that I can think of. I think I kind of said it before, but just treatment is out there, help is out there, and you are not alone.
If you're just tuning in now, you're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. We are discussing post-traumatic stress disorder today as part of our series on invisible illnesses. If any of this information is triggering or disturbing to you, the Vancouver Island Crisis Line can always be reached at 1-888-494-3888. So who's at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder? Sort of the classical viewpoint on who develops it is veterans of war and first responders. That could be like firefighters, paramedics, police officers. But really, there's any kind of trauma can cause it. And Matt can elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that trauma is extremely subjective and individualistic. What one person views as traumatic, somebody else might not find it traumatic at all. And because of that, people can develop PTSD from a range of different experiences. And as we're coming to see through some different things on the news, like recently the wildfires in Fort McMurray, there's been some people who've had some long-lasting psychological effects from that, as well as things like significant illnesses, traumas that they may have had, or like cancers, anything really that is a significant traumatizing life event, someone can develop long-lasting issues from. We're going to listen to an interview that I had with two very good friends of mine now, Andrew and Jason. A few years ago, they underwent a traumatizing experience where they were trapped in a cave here on Vancouver Island for 14 hours as it was flooding. They were able to survive this experience and cope with the stress that they endured. They are both very resilient people, in my opinion, and they've gone on to do several more caving expeditions since then. And we're going to explore how they were able to be resilient and overcome what happened to them. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
No worries, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How long ago was it now?
4.5 years,
Yeah,
just
four
over
and
4.
change.
Yeah.
December 5th, 2015.
We were on a caving trip. It was probably my 4th or 5th trip overall, and my second trip in that particular cave. There was 5 of us that went all the way down fairly far into the cave. Part of the cave called the Bastard's Crawl. And I got into a bit of trouble in the Bastard's Crawl. It's essentially, when weather's dry, there's a little creek that runs through it. And as we discovered that day, when you have the sort of storm of the season come through, it can get very full of water, and you can have a raging river going through there. And what had happened is I had made it up through the Bastard's Crawl, even though there was a fair amount of water coming. It wasn't anything that wasn't navigable at that time, but then I sort of had a moment of indecision. I didn't know which way to go from the other end of it, and so I turned around. I should have just stayed put. That's kind of one little regret. I could have just stayed put and then asked for directions when someone else caught up to me, but instead I turned around and went back down through the bastard's crawl, and I got jammed into the rocks with the water behind my back, and it was bubbling up and over my ears, and I got trapped and stuck and nearly drowned. That was sort of the first time on that trip that Andrew stepped up and saved my life.
Yeah, it was a pretty serious situation. I mean, it happens really fast. Anyone who's been in a bad accident can tell you it kind of happens more quickly than you would like. But we managed to deal with that, and Jason got out. And by the time we got kind of our wits about us again, got warm and made a plan, we had run out of time. So we were stuck. The cave, the water just kept coming and getting higher and higher and higher, and there was a point where we just had to make the decision that there was just no possible way we were going to get out that day. And so we just kind of switched from caving mode into survival mode and built ourselves a little nest as best we could, kind of at the top of this 40-foot waterfall in this little crack in the wall, and just hunkered down and waited for things to change, for a chance to try and get ourselves out.
And you were trapped in there for 14 hours before you were able to get out?
Yeah, we spent about 14 hours kind of immobile in that little crack. It was about the size of a sheet of plywood.
What was it like? Like, I went back with you a few months later after that to get some of your gear and stuff, and that was the first time that you'd both been back in that cave. How were you able to kind of cope with being back in there after the incident?
I found it surprisingly easy. I think because we went back in May in the middle of a dry spell and there was no rain in the forecast, and in fact when we got down to the problem area, there was probably the lowest amount of water I'd ever seen, just a trickle going through where there had been a torrent before. I think that helped make it almost an entirely different place. It wasn't the cave itself, it was the water part of Mother Nature that caused the distress on the day. So I was able to compartmentalize the what had happened on that worst stormy night against now if we had gotten down there and the water had been flowing heavily, I don't know that I'd have carried on into the cave further and gone through. That might have freaked me out a little bit too much. For me, the claustrophobia wasn't part of the equation. The awful torrent of water was, and that wasn't there. Not that it didn't play on my mind a little bit as we approached that area. I found myself wondering, will I have a point where I start to panic? When will that come? And I was constantly aware of that and thinking about it. But in the end, it never did arrive.
Yeah, I got to reiterate what Jason said. I found it surprisingly straightforward emotionally and mentally. I think the average person kind of finds it unfathomable that you would ever go back to a place where you had an experience like that. But there's a catharsis there that happens. I've been caving for a long time, and it's a big sport that I love, and I plan a lot of vacations and international trips around it. And I hadn't been in that intervening period, and so there's a point where you're asking yourself, am I ever going to do this again? Am I just going to mothball all my equipment in the garage and never go caving again? Then it almost felt, and Jason and I had talked about it, it almost felt like that needed to be the next cave that we went in, was to go back there. And conditions being what they were, it was a lot of fun. We had a fun day, and kind of supplanting some of those negative memories with some positive ones. I think we were really motivated to do that, and that's kind of put a tone over the whole trip that allowed us just kind of have a positive mindset and just have some fun and do the thing that we enjoy doing, rather than making it this big deal that it didn't have to be, or putting any pressure on ourselves to feel a certain way, or
Do you feel like some of the other interviews that you've done and talking with other people and sort of exploring the issue, and you've done some teaching around cave rescue since then, do you think that's also helped to process it, or has that sort of made it difficult? Was it difficult for you to talk about it?
I'd say talking about it in the early stages probably helped me a lot. Simply sharing the story with family and friends once, they found out that this had happened. I certainly got very emotional. I would recount the story to, one set of relatives or friends, and I would choke up in the middle of telling the story at one or two places, and then I'd be telling another group of friends or relatives the story, and I would choke up somewhere else entirely different. It just, something would catch me off guard in the telling of the story. But I feel by repeating that process, I was sort of dealing with my emotions. It was definitely helping me.
Did either of you notice any unusual signs or symptoms that might have been related to PTSD after?
I definitely, it manifested itself for me definitely with the sound of rushing water. And
100%.
Yeah, and the look of rushing water. I think people think of PTSD perhaps, and they think of flashbacks, and they think of people freaking out. It wasn't like that, but it was definitely something that I just found disgusting. Even the sound of the bath running in the other room sounded really disgusting for a few weeks afterwards.
Yeah, for me as well, the auditory part is the most persistent, negative memory. It's definitely the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life, and will be, hopefully I never have something louder than that. I volunteered as a firefighter, so not too long after that, we were on a call where we had to flow a lot of water, and the sound of the water coming out of the fire hose is very close to that, and that was kind of triggering for me. I definitely need to psych myself up every time before I watch the footage, and I didn't watch it for a long time. I was too stressed out when I plugged the camera in and realized that it was still functioning. I dumped all the files on my computer and kind of watched the first 2 or 3, which were still when we were having fun, and they were so triggering I almost deleted everything. I definitely was not interested in pursuing that. But as time goes on and you talk about it, and then you realize that while you're showing signs of post-traumatic stress, it's not crippling. You can still get through. I didn't really self-medicate a lot, or I wasn't too sullen and withdrawn from my friends and family and stuff. But
what do you think the term resiliency means to each of you, and do you think that concept has changed at all given your experiences?
Yeah, it's a complex topic to be able to get up and continue to function despite feeling a lot of challenging emotions surrounding a really significant event. I remember Jason saying, this is later on, this is the story we'll be telling our grandkids, at family gatherings, right? And the kids probably won't even believe half of it, but it happened. Working as a first responder, resiliency is really important for a lot of reasons, because you end up being exposed to a lot of really unpleasant events, a lot of really unpleasant scenes and sights and sounds and smells too, and just being able to say, I choose to take this on again, having that agency and that choice, because we don't have to, right? We didn't have to go caving again. There's really no reason to, other than the personal need to go through that. And so resiliency for me, it just kind of revolves around the choice to say, I'm choosing to take this on again. I feel like I have the capacity to do it again, to be exposed to that. Not that every shift or every caving trip has something bad that happens. Most of the time it doesn't. Generally it's okay and actually really fun. But after that event, especially on bigger trips overseas with people I'm not super familiar with, and terrain that I'm have no idea where I'm at, it's you got to continually remind yourself that this is a choice that you're making, and that it's not a debilitating, crippling indecision that you are nope, I'm going to do this. I'm resilient. I can handle it. And then just remembering that, to give yourself the space that it's okay if you don't. It's okay to say, no, I'm going to sit this one out, or I want to turn around halfway through, not to feel pressured because of the way people perceive you, or who you're supposed to be, or who you think you are, right? Because every day you got to decide, am I resilient enough to subject myself to this again? Which I think I said before, nobody would blame us if we never wanted to again, because it was so significant. But I think for both of us, we still definitely enjoy it a lot.
I think that's part of the key for me as well, is that I enjoyed it so much before the incident. If it was something that I was sitting on the fence about before the incident, then maybe I wouldn't have been all that bothered about going back. But for me, the resiliency comes from saying, I enjoyed this so much that I've got to find a way to continue to enjoy it and get back on that horse, as it were. At the risk of sounding like a Facebook meme that's a bit Hallmark card, like a Hallmark card, there's some sort of comment about bravery. It doesn't mean that you're not scared of things. It's that you get up and face them even when you are scared of them. And that, in a nutshell, is resiliency. It's simply getting back on that horse if it's something that you love and or feel has value for yourself as a human. And you're not going to enjoy life as much by giving it up. Then, despite feeling a certain fear of going back, you have to find a way to process those feelings and get back at it.
People watch the footage and it's just like, oh my goodness, like that's so traumatizing and like what a crazy thing to have happen, but they don't think of any of the value of that, right? Or what positives you could find from it. And I think resiliency is really important to realize that, you're building yourself, and even though you're having negative experiences, they still have like a net gain of positivity, right? That there are little nuggets of things you can pull out of it. One of them is like, that we're brave people, right? That you've like tested yourself in this like, crucible of awfulness and you persevered, you made it out, right? And you can draw on that strength for life, right? Like it's inconceivable to think of a situation that would be worse than the one that we were in, right? So like how, you wake up the next morning and you can think like, the worst day of my life is behind me, right? Like the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to a human being, like, in one sense of the word, has happened already, right? Like it's definitely the next day is going to be better than the last one, right? So I think you need to remind yourself of that. Like I think you need to tell yourself that if you're not having a great day mentally because of things that have happened, that's allowed, like that you don't have to pretend like it was no big deal. Because I think initially I tried to do that. I kind of just tried to be like, oh yeah, close call. Wasn't, people would ask. And I think that's changed the way my memory, or like I perceived it, right? Because your memory edits out like a lot of the bad parts. And I think if we didn't have the footage, we would never really kind of know just how bad it had been, right? Because I think your memory kind of changes that for the better, does it, to kind of protect your mental health.
You're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. Today we're talking about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, as we continue our semester of discussing invisible illnesses within our community. Once again, some of the things that we talk about today can be stressful and triggering for some people, and if you feel triggered, please reach out to the Vancouver Island Crisis Line at 1-888-494-3888.
We're going to play you a song. It's called Save Me Some Sunshine by Rafferty.
You gotta teach me how to play it.
Been back east in the cold and rain. Last night I barely survived. I want a taste of your shining rays, and I can't wait till next time. Hey, you make me feel just so Save me some sunshine. I'm on my
to teach me how to play it.
We were lucky enough to be able to interview Dr. Leigh Blaney from the Faculty of Nursing at Vancouver Island University. She's a mental health nurse with a long history of caring for trauma survivors, and was happy to share some of her wisdom with us. Hello, Nanaimo. We're here with Dr. Leigh Blaney at Vancouver Island University, and before we begin with our interview, we'd like to just start by getting a little bit of your history and your background in your own words.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about myself and also to talk about health. So my background is as a psychiatric mental health nurse. I've been in the field for many years. I used to be dually registered as a registered psychiatric nurse and a registered nurse. And in my off time from psychiatry, I spent time as a labor and delivery nurse. But I kept getting drawn back to mental health and to psychiatry, and that's just been part of who I am and probably my DNA for most of my career. Along with teaching as a BSN faculty member at VIU, I'm also involved with emergency services providers, police, fire, ambulance, hospital staff, and looking at critical incident stress management. I've been doing that for about 25 years, putting together teams and educating around critical incident stress management strategies, defusings, debriefings, that kind of thing. I started that by actually working in a small private practice as a counselor with military personnel who had come back from in-theater experience, and they had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their experience overseas. And then I started to see some emergency services personnel who also had PTSD. And being a good little nurse, I started to think about, there's some ways to prevent PTSD. So that kind of put me into the realm of critical incident stress management, or CISM. And from there, developed an interest over the years in resilience. We know of nothing that can prevent PTSD. We know very little about the treatment of PTSD, and we also don't know why the majority of people don't develop PTSD, that they are resilient to traumatic events, and that became my area of interest, was around resilience and exploring resilience with emergency services personnel, firefighters volunteer firefighters in particular.
Can you talk a little bit about the differences between resiliency and stoicism and how they might be different?
Yeah, I'm going to start out first by talking about the differences in the terminology between resiliency and resilience. Resiliency is a static trait. It's a personality trait. It's part of what we're kind of born with. It's not amenable to change. It's within us, like stoicism is. Whereas I think what we're looking at here is resilience, which is more of a process. It develops, it waxes and wanes. The outcome that we find with it is that there is a fairly immediate bounce back to adverse events, that people will return to that pre-trauma level of functioning and thinking and coping. When I'm talking today, I'm going to be talking about resilience because it is a changeable, dynamic, and multi-leveled, multi-faceted construct. There's been a lot of work done in the field of resilience over the last probably 10 years in particular, across a wide variety of contexts. Nobody has a common understanding of what resilience is. When I was doing some research, I sort of stopped looking for definitions of resilience when I found 52 different definitions for resilience. So it seemed important that we come up with, I was working with firefighters at the time, and it seemed important that we come up with a definition of resilience that would fit for firefighters. So the definition that we came up with through a lot of research and a lot of conversation was that resilience is a system of interconnected pathways through adversity that is dynamic, as I said earlier on, multidimensional, multi-leveled, and it's transformative, but it's a health construct. It is not an illness avoidance or anything like that. It's all about the internal workings of individuals and organizational and community health. So you may have bad things happen to you, and people may or may not develop disease as a result of those bad things, whether it be physical disease or mental disease. But they're still resilient human beings. They wake up in the morning, every morning, ideally, and there are things that they can do to sort of boost that resilience and minimize the impact, I suppose, of some of those adverse events or even diagnoses.
So it's very much a personal thing and very unique to the individual.
It is, but there are some common areas or common components of resilience, and that idea of a system of interrelated or interconnected pathways can make the thinking about resilience really confusing and really overwhelming. But we can break it down into 6 different components, and each component can be worked on individually or community, collectively, that kind of thing, to build resilience or enhance resilience or to allow people to return or get back in touch with those resilient parts of themselves.
That sounds similar to like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness, where you're kind of being aware of your own patterns of behavior.
Yeah, so mindfulness is one of the strategies within one of the components of resilience. So there's 6 components of resilience. The first one is relationships, and that's stuff like social connections, family and organizational connections, friendships, intimate relationships, those kinds of things. Those are all really important to return to resilience, because when people are feeling stressed or they're facing adversity, they often feel isolated or they'll step back. So we really want those relationships people to be aware that those relationships are important and that they may need to work at them and that they may need to reach out, or others need to reach out to the person who has experienced the adversity. The second category is personal resources, and that'll be the stuff like you just talked about, the specific strategies, coping mechanisms, techniques that people use. So mindfulness is a big one. Mindfulness, yoga, self reflection, and things like reframing negative thoughts. Mm-hmm. There's also physical stuff, the things that we typically think of for building resilience: exercise, watch what we put into our bodies, nutrition-wise. And fluid-wise. So there's a number of, everybody has different personal resources, but again, they feel sometimes like they can't access those, or that they forget about some important ones when they faced adversity. The third component of resilience is meaning making. That's a term that the firefighters came up with to sort of make some sense of that adverse event or those adverse events that have happened. That, for example, for nurses and for firefighters, one of the ways we make meaning of terrible events is often to reflect on it and then to think things like, I did the very best that I could do. I provided a service to an individual at a time of great need. On someone's worst day of their life, I actually was able to provide some information or whatever it is. So that's kind of the meaning-making piece. There's also spirituality and faith practices that come into that as well. The fourth component is leadership, and for again, individuals, actually surviving some adverse events is a form of leadership. They are actually leading the way in survivorship, and that might sound a little bit bizarre, but it actually, if you put it in the context of high-risk professions like nursing and firefighting, it is actually facing the adversity of the job on an ongoing basis, taking some leadership and actually surviving that, and in sharing knowledge and increasing others' capacity to be resilient. So sharing those personal resources as well. The fifth component is culture, and culture can be your own individual culture within your family. It can be a geographic culture. It can be an organizational culture. It can be a variety of different interpretations of culture. The key points about culture and resilience are that it ties in with relationships, and it ties in with meaning making and personal resources, in that between two people or a team of people or a unit or an organization, you can actually come together and make positive change or rethink some of the negative experiences or negative interpretations of culture. Because when we feel stressed, particularly in nursing or fire service or ambulance or whatever, we'll often fall back on it's the organization's fault. It's a problem within the organization. But we're all part of that organization and we're part of that culture. So we can actually bring forward some ways of increasing or improving that culture so that we are much more attuned to one another and supportive of one another. And rather than thinking those really negative thoughts, we can reframe some of those about what's working within the organization. And then the final component of resilience that we discovered was knowledge, and that is just basic information about health, about what resilience, the difference between resiliency and resilience itself, some differences between how we can build resilience, how we can maintain resilience, and how we can get back in touch with resilience. So knowledge, learning about these 6 components, practicing these different aspects of resilience, they all come together to form this very multi-dimensional, multi-layered interpretation of what resilience is.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like it would be difficult for somebody who has experienced a significant trauma to develop a lot of these after the fact. So would you say it's maybe better if you can to try and develop them proactively rather than reactively?
Yeah, because I think we gotta realize that everybody is resilient. We wake up breathing every morning, therefore we are resilient at some level, and that's a really simplified version of resilience. And we all have capacities within us to remain resilient or to be more resilient. So from a proactive versus reactive perspective, I think we have to step back from looking at trauma or traumatic events or adverse events as being really negative and creating negative outcomes for us. They can rock our world, but they don't have to destroy our world or blow up our world. And so if we have the ability to recognize that we might not feel as resilient as possible, but the bottom line is I woke up breathing today, so that's a foundational step. From there, we then can pull in some other of those pre-existing resilience strategies. But I agree that there's, as far as information or knowledge related to resilience, we never know enough, so we can just keep building that knowledge, and that can be in any of those 6 categories. Just developing more techniques, more strategies, more coping mechanisms, being able to reflect more deeply and make meaning of events, of thinking about sort of myself or self as a leader in coming through these events, because people do come through, and we don't value that coming through and bounce back piece. We're very deficit focused on what's missing, and resilience is all about what's actually there and how do we build further on that.
Right, and kind of like changing your perspective, if you can, to not think, why did this happen to me? This was so terrible, but what can I learn from this, and how can I grow from this experience?
Exactly. It also means not to underestimate the power of those negative events, because they can really rock you and rock your world. But if you look at that rocking piece, or look at it from a rocking perspective, it's not about destroying, and we have the capacity to actually move beyond those types of events and grow from them. But regardless of putting on the Pollyanna rose-colored glasses, you do a great job coming through bad events. It's really important to recognize that bad events can rock us. They don't have to destroy us, and that's the key piece. And the more resilient we are, the more resilient capacities, and the more in touch with our resilience, the more likely we are to bounce back more quickly.
What are some ways that we can help build and encourage resilience in other people?
Well, I think just having some conversations about what it is that they see as those aspects, and then breaking it down, because it can seem pretty overwhelming and airy-fairy. So if you think of resilience as a system, and there's these 6 components that go together with the system that interact with one another, pick one of those. pick relationships and say, okay, I'm going to actually really focus on building my relationships so I have a strong social network here, or pick personal resources. I know I need to exercise, but well, you know what, I'm tired and I don't feel like going out for a run today. Or then just go for a walk around the block. Just pick aspects of those, break it down into achievable strategies or mechanisms, and just go out and do it. And it actually then you're participating in your own health that way.
And maybe not worrying so much about how other people are managing issues that they've come across, because it is so individual for everybody.
It is, but we can learn from one another, and I think that's that social network and sharing of knowledge. Both of those components come into play. But again, our society tends to be quite deficit focused, so we talk about how bad things are instead of what I'm doing to actually get through this. And that, I think, requires us to change our conversations, change the style of our conversation, and change the focus of our conversations. So yes, horrible things happen to people, and horrible outcomes come from that. But also, there's many people, and as I said, resilience being the most common outcome. What can we learn from those people? So let's have a conversation about, how are you getting through this? How are you surviving this? How are you thriving within this terrible event that has happened? We value those deficits, and we value talking about those deficits. You've got this diagnosis, so we're going to talk about that diagnosis instead of, okay, well, that's one part of your life. You're not your diagnosis. What are the other parts of your life? And talking about, again, what are some things that are getting you through? And helping people recognize what the strengths they are, asking people. And certainly as nurses, we need to be doing this with every single patient. Yes, you're in this hospital bed, and say in an acute care setting, you're in this hospital bed, and you've got this diagnosis, but what are the strengths? What are some things that are getting you through this bad experience? How can we build on those, and how can we support you in maintaining those while you're going through this bad experience?
Yeah, it's applicable to far more than just traumatic experiences and mental illness.
Absolutely, it is. And I think that, again, the more we have that conversation around resilience overall, just like we're trying to do with health promotion and social determinants of health in society, the more able we're going to be to have those conversations. We're very much focused on, in nursing anyways, those medical diagnoses. And there's more to people than their labels.
Awesome. Leigh, thank you very much for your
you.
time. We really appreciate your input and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thanks. It's great to see you guys again. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you kindly.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We encourage you to reach out to your healthcare provider for more information. Always check out our Facebook page for resources related to today's show. Every episode is uploaded to our YouTube channel if you'd like to hear it again. If there are any topics you'd like us to explore, please contact us at asoundconstitution@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.